Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to YIES, Yomiuri International Economic Society lecture meeting. I will be serving as the moderator today. I am Kuroi, Senior Research Fellow at Yomiuri Research Institute. Today, we have with us Professor Joseph Eugene Stiglitz from the Columbia University of the United States, who will be talking under the topic of rethinking capitalism and the market economy. Before we start the lecture, let me briefly introduce the speaker. After serving as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors and senior vice president and chief economist at the World Bank, he received the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2001. In the previous year, in December 2000, he gave a lecture at YIES, and this is his second lecture in 23 years. Professor Stiglitz, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here again. The topic I'm going to talk about is rethinking capitalism and the market economy. I think all over the world there's a lot of discussion about rethinking capitalism. And the reason is that things haven't worked out quite as well as one would have hoped. And what I want to do is first spend a lot of time talking about some of the failures, because once one gets a good diagnosis of the failures, some of the prescriptions of what needs to be done become more apparent. I'm going to talk a great deal about the United States, but I'll make some reference to Japan and some other countries. The reason I refer to the United States is partly because it's the country I know best, but it's also partly that it's the country which has taken certain ideas of capitalism to the extreme. And by seeing what happens when you go to the extreme, you can understand the dangers and the problems of capitalism. So in some ways, here in Japan, you don't see the problems as clearly as we do in the United States because we've taken it further than you have. And it's very much a word of warning. The particular variant of capitalism I'm talking about is sometimes referred to as neoliberal capitalism. And we've had it in its essence for about 40 years. I'll refer a little bit later to ideas of people like Hayek and Friedman, who sort of set the agenda that got adopted politically by Reagan and Thatcher in the US and the UK, but it became bipartisan in both the United States, Europe, and to some extent in Japan. The Democrats, the President Clinton, for whom I worked, adopted many of the tenets of neoliberalism. We had a lot of fights between various sides of the Clinton administration, but in the end, even though I opposed it, I delayed it, but in the end we had financial deregulation, we had trade liberalization, we had many of the ideas that were central to neoliberal neoliberal capitalism. So the notion is that deregulation, privatization, the reduction of the role of the state, and the reduction of progressive taxation were supposed to lead to faster growth. And through a process of trickle-down economics where growth at the top would benefit everybody, everyone would benefit. But what happened was just the opposite. And I don't think it's really fully realized what's happened. You know, history moves on year by year, but you don't look back and see what has happened over a period of 40 years. Growth slowed. What growth occurred went overwhelmingly to those at the top. The economies became less stable. We had in 2008 the global financial crisis, which was the worst downturn in 75 years, and demonstrated not only the economy was not stable, but it was very inefficient. We had allocated enormous amount of resources, scarce capital resources, to housing in the wrong places, and that was just one manifestation of the inefficiencies and instabilities in the economy. And then we've just gone through the pandemic, and it's shown another darker side that people all over the world are worrying about, which is lack of economic security. We saw the market economy was not very resilient. We had shortages giving rise to unprecedented episode of inflation. And we had shortages of amazing kinds of things. We couldn't get baby formula in the United States. It's the kind of thing you expect to see in Soviet Union, where you had to queue and you had to run from store to store to find things. But in the United States, we had shortages of one thing after another. So to look at the big promise was higher growth, but if we look at the numbers, it was just the opposite. As we reformed the economy started growing more slowly. It didn't grow faster, it grew more slowly. So these numbers show what's happened between the period 1960 to 90, a 30-year period, versus 1990 to 2018, the most recent year we had the data at the time. And you see, for instance, from the United States, the growth had been, in terms of per capita income, which is what you care about, went from 2.5% down to 1.5%. That was a 60% reduction in the growth rate of per capita income. And that's true of most of the other countries in the advanced countries. And now Japan was even worse. Japan went from a very impressive growth rate in the first period of 5.4% to only 0.9%. But there was one factor that makes the analysis of interpretation of the data for Japan more difficult, was because Japan slowed its population growth, became negative. And so the dependency ratio, the ratio of the working age population to the total population went down. And that change in demography explains a significant part of the performance, but not all of it, as we'll see in a minute. And when we think about Japan, there's one thing that stands out, which is the fact that Japan has the highest life expectancy. And what stands out about the United States is that among the advanced countries, it has the lowest. Not only does the United States have the lowest level of life expectancy, we spend more on healthcare, almost 20% of GDP, and life expectancy has been declining. And we also have huge inequalities in life expectancy. I'll talk about inequalities in income, but the inequalities in life expectancy are also very large in the United States. We usually think of high life expectancy as an important measure of well-being. an important part of our standard of living, especially those of us who are older think of it as an important aspect of our well-being. And it suggests that something is going right in Japan, even if other things are not going well. And I think one needs to think about what is the source of that positive that leads to that high level of well-being. Well, life expectancy. But there are some areas, even where Japan is not doing very well, and one of that is productivity per hour. I don't want to put too much reliance on that because measuring hours is very difficult. You may be at work and not working and enjoying work. So interpreting the data is difficult, but in terms of the data that we have, productivity per hour in Japan is below the average of the OECD and lower than it was in 2015. So it has not been performing very well. And I think one of the concerns about that, the other country where it's not doing very well is the UK. And there we know part of the reason is that there's been inadequate investments, both public and private, in the economy. One of the dimensions which, when I first came to Japan more than 50 years ago, was one of the positive aspects of Japan was it was a country with a high level of equality. It was one of the most equal of the advanced countries. And unfortunately, over the last half century, it's lost its standing in equality. It's still not as bad as the United States. I said in the beginning, the United States shows the extreme case. We are the most unequal of the advanced countries, unequal not only in income and wealth, but also opportunity. A lot of people think of the American dream, that everybody can make it from the bottom to the top. Well, I hate to tell you, but that's a myth. If you look at the statistics, the life prospects of young American are more dependent on income and education of his parents than in almost any of the other advanced countries. So, what's happened in the last half century is that Japan's standing as one of the most equal countries is weakening, and it's now the 10th most unequal of the countries of the advanced world. And that graph sort of illustrates that. Other measures of inequality in Japan are more mixed, although the overall poverty is lower. In some recent UNICEF ranking, childhood poverty is not, it ranks actually even worse, 21st. And that's because the families where there are children are on average lower income, and more of them are in poverty. So what I've tried to do here is to give you a brief view in the statistics of why I think things haven't gone very well. I could also talk a lot about from the U.S. perspective, a lot of the other problems that we see. For instance, we had the opioid crisis, the drug companies taking advantage of getting addictive products, cigarettes pushing addictive products. We have a problem of monopolization. We have a problem of childhood diabetes as a result of food companies pushing addictive fat food, and all the efforts that we have for-profit education companies pushing people to buy education that doesn't deliver any jobs. So I could go through a long list of problems that have led many people in the United States to say things are not going very well. So I want to now turn to the next topic, which is trying to understand what went wrong. Because we began with ideas like that of Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, that said neoliberal capitalism was supposed to lead to higher growth. Everybody would benefit. It hasn't happened. So from a point of view of economic theory, we want to understand these failures. Well, the first is that the idea that markets would lead to efficiency and stability, the idea that Adam Smith had, that pursuit of self-interest would lead as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society, has been a subject of scrutiny of economic theorists for a very long time. And about in the middle of the last century, Arrow and DeBrew, two great economists, both of whom got the Nobel Prize, showed that that idea wasn't right. Or let me put it more precisely, they showed the conditions under which markets would lead to efficiency and stability were very restrictive and not satisfied by any real-world economy. And I'll describe some of the examples in a few minutes, but what I want to point out that we knew even before Friedman started advocating free market, so-called free markets, we knew that unfettered markets did not lead to economic efficiency. He just didn't want to, he didn't want to give recognition to these ideas that were recognized, for instance, by a Nobel Prize. And then my own work later in the century showed that the conditions were even more restrictive than Arrow and DeBrew had shown, that in order for markets to be efficient and stable required perfect information and perfect risk markets. And that led me to the conclusion that, the bottom line on the slide, the reason the invisible hand is invisible is it's not there. And so we can't rely on markets by themselves for economic efficiency. That was the middle of the last century. What's happened since then have made matters worse. And here I've talked about some of the changes in economic structure, the world, and technology that made it more difficult for the markets to deliver good outcomes. The first I refer to here is urbanization. And in cities, we live very closely together, and what one person does affects others. You can have noise pollution, you can have air pollution, you can have all kinds of environmental pollution, and you need to have some way of regulating it. You have traffic congestion. You need stoplights. If you didn't have stoplights, you would have gridlock, and nobody could move. So you need regulations to say who can go at one time and who can go at another. And these regulations actually give us more freedom. Because with gridlock, nobody has the freedom to move. With a little stoplight, you're restricted, but in the end, you have more freedom than you have in a gridlock. So that illustrates how in an urban environment, you have more interdependence, and you need, therefore, more regulations. And unfettered markets don't work as well. And then finally, we had climate change, which we didn't think about, didn't know about. Actually, we did know about it. The idea of climate change was recognized at the end of the 19th century by Arrhenius, a Swedish chemist physicist. He predicted that there would be climate change. He understood what would happen of the greenhouse gases before we had the ways of measuring it. So it was a great scientific achievement to be able to say if we have more greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere, it will trap the energy and the Earth will get warmer. He predicted that, and we now know, and we've known now for almost a half century, that it's right, empirically. And we are now feeling the consequences of that more and more. I was on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the second assessment back in 1995, and the one big mistake we made is we didn't anticipate how fast things would move and how bad things would become so quickly. Well, climate change is an externality. You can't leave it to the market. You have to have some way of regulations, public investment, carbon pricing, some way of intervening in the unfettered market to restrict carbon emissions. And if we don't, we will all suffer. And then the new technologies associated with the digital economy, for instance, have exacerbated the problems of market power. There are what we call network externalities, low marginal costs, economies of scale in use and extraction of information. And then finally, something that Japan has led the world is an aging population. And that's important because it has increased the importance of what we call the purple or the care economy. And the care economy is a part of the economy where competition markets by themselves are particularly, don't work. In many ways, neoliberalism made matters worse. It gave rise to a more interconnected, fragile financial systems. Example, of course, was the financial crisis, where the collapse of one firm, the Lehman Brothers, brought down the whole financial system. And as a side, economists have paid, central bankers in almost all countries have paid insufficient attention to this interdependence, the linkages between one financial institution and another. I wrote a book with my colleague Bruce Greenwald in 2003, and we talked about the importance of interdependence and talked about bankruptcy cascades. But the central bankers weren't interested in it. There was only one central bank that paid much attention to it, and that was the UK. But in the United States, where the data, where it was transparent what was going on, the ideology of neoliberalism with people like Ben Bernanke were so strong that they believed that the market would take care of it. But they didn't understand the externalities and the systemic nature of the fragility. A second aspect of what I think has been a consequence of neoliberalism is a short-sightedness. Short-sightedness with the shareholder capitalism, of which Milton Friedman was a strong advocate. And that has contributed to the less resilient economy. One of the great contributions of Japan to thinking about manufacturing was just-in-time inventories. And just-in-time inventories were a good way of increasing productivity, but they were very short-sighted, because just-in-time inventory works well as long as the economy doesn't have any big disturbance. But when we had a big disturbance like the pandemic, Ukraine war, with nobody has inventories, the whole system collapsed, and the supply chains just collapsed. And we saw the consequences that I referred to earlier. There was a kind of short-sightedness. Again, in 2006, I wrote a book called Making Globalization Work. I said it was very short-sighted for Germany to become so dependent on Russian gas. I said, Russia is not a reliable trade partner. Bush said he looked into the eyes of Putin and he said he was somebody he could trust. I looked at what Putin was doing and I said, somebody you couldn't trust. And I think in the end I was right and Bush was wrong. And Germany and Europe suffered a lot when Russia invaded Ukraine. So they took the cheap gas now, but didn't think about what would happen if Russia changed its policies. So that's an example of short-sightedness leading to a lack of resilience. Shareholder capitalism, we said that you should only care about your shareholders, denigrated the importance of other stakeholders, workers, environment, customers, community. They treated workers as a cost to be exploited to the extent that they could. And the result was that wages stagnated in many countries. At the bottom, in the United States, the minimum wage, the wages paid by at the bottom, are the same today as they were 65 years ago. Can you imagine having no pay raise in 65 years? I mean, you think back about what Japan was like 65 years ago, you would think that's a pretty terrible situation. And of course, a lot of American workers feel the same way. Another aspect of neoliberalism was the belief that markets by themselves were competitive on their own. You didn't have to worry about competition policy because there was entry and that would ensure competition. And Chicago had enormous influence, the Chicago economists who believed this, had enormous influence in our legal system, and the result of that was the Supreme Court adopted a lot of their views, and now it's very hard to change. And the result of that was that there was inadequate enforcement of competition laws and inadequate adaptation of the laws to the changing economy, and all of this contributed to a less competitive economy in which the share of profits was going up, helping the stock market to go up, but contributing to wage stagnation, not only at the bottom, but also in the middle. But not only did neoliberalism denigrate the importance of workers, environment, customers, community, it also denigrated the role of government, making it more difficult to solve collective problems, problems that only government can address. They rewrote the rules of the economy in ways that contributed to wage stagnation, exacerbated financial instability, inequality, and market power. It was one thing to take away, make taxes less progressive, but they went so far as to make our tax system regressive. So those at the top paid a smaller share of their income in taxes than those down below. Some of those people at the top even raised questions about it. Warren Buffett said, why was it that he was paying a lower tax rate than his secretary? And when he said that, he wasn't even calculating correctly how low his taxes were because he didn't include his unrealized capital gains. If he included the unrealized capital gain, his share of his tax rate was really minuscule. Neoliberalism refused to impose environmental taxes, which would have helped with climate change. They put profits over the planet. One of the things that I've urged the late Prime Minister Abe over and over again is to impose a carbon tax. And I argued that imposing a carbon tax would have the advantage that it would raise revenue and stimulate the economy, because you would have to make investments to retrofit the economy. So it was an unusual tax. It was a progressive, it stimulated the economy, and made it dealt with the environmental externality. And finally, one of the things that economists haven't thought about a lot, but are beginning to think about, is how society affects individuals themselves. Standard economic theory, all of you who've taken economics courses, one of the basic assumptions was that individuals enter the world with their beliefs, preferences. We don't talk about how individuals are shaped. But we know that they are shaped by the environment, those around us, by our society. They're shaped by our economic system. And there are increasing studies in the United States showing that capitalism, ruthless capitalism, has resulted in more selfish, short-sighted, and less honest individuals. There were, of course, other arguments besides efficiency for neoliberal capitalism, but I think they were as wrong as the standard economic arguments. So central to then what Hayek and Friedman and other advocates of neoliberal capitalism argued, they argued that it expanded individual freedoms and ensured political freedom. And they used words like free enterprise rather than private enterprise as a way of describing the economy. And they should have said private enterprise, because whether it's free or not, if your company is free to exploit somebody else, that's taking away somebody else's freedom. So how you think about freedom depends on what perspective you have. So we should have, they were trying to use these words to change how we think about private markets. In fact, when we think about what happened, is they neither expanded individual freedom or ensured political freedom. They expanded the freedom of some at the expense of the freedom of others. So Milton Friedman wrote a famous book with his wife called Free to Choose. I relabeled their book Free to Exploit. And all the examples I gave earlier in my talk about how cigarette companies exploited, how Purdue exploited, Purdue was the company that produced the opioid, the addictive opioids, the food companies exploited. So that lack of regulations led them free to exploit others, but took away the freedom of those who were exploited. Trump University is another example. Trump University exploited the aspiration of some people to get higher, to move up, but it didn't deliver anything, and in the end, they had to pay millions of dollars to compensate those who they had exploited. Another aspect of freedom is freedom to live up to your potential, and again, neoliberal capitalism deprived many large fractions of our population the ability freedom to live up to their potential. Finally, the extremes of inequality that I referred to earlier, and of which the United States was exemplary, have provided a fertile field for demagogues and right-wing populism, which you see in the extreme form in the U.S. In the U.S. and elsewhere, on I believe that this kind of neoliberal capitalism has not set us on the road. Hayek wrote this famous book called The Road to Serfdom, arguing that too large a government would lead us on the road to authoritarianism and serfdom. He wrote it in the middle of the 20th century, 1944, but what has actually happened is that these extremes of inequality have put us on the road to what I call the 21st century fascism. The most stable democratic countries are those with the strong welfare states, high levels of social protection, and high levels of equality. So I hope I've tried to explain, maybe at too great a length, why it is that neoliberal capitalism didn't deliver on its promise, didn't deliver growth, and led to greater inequality. Try to do it in very short, central ideas. So that leaves us with the question, is there an alternative? And the central point I want to make is, yes, there is an alternative. And I want to describe that alternative, which I call progressive capitalism. Other people call it new capitalism. Modern economies require a high level of decentralization. Enterprises can take multiple forms. They can be for-profit, not-for-profit, cooperatives, public. The important point is that collective action is critical. And there are collective action in turn can take multiple forms. It can take a form of unions, co-ops, civil society, class action suits. There are many areas where for-profit is particularly unsuitable, like the caring economy. I mentioned before the aging economy. It's especially important in an economy undergoing constant transformation because there's a need to reskill. Education becomes more important. And education, like the caring economy, turns out to be an area, and health, are all areas where the for-profit motive often leads to bad outcomes. And one of the examples of this was very dramatic during COVID-19. Many people were surprised at how the high death rate in Sweden. And one of the reasons for that is they had privatized their old age homes. And in privatizing, they hadn't taken the appropriate precautions for care for the elderly. And the result of that was that the young people did quite well in Sweden, the death rate among the people in the old age homes was very, very high. And the trade-off they made between profits and caring was the wrong trade-off. They put profits over lives. So the most important point is the one I raise at the last line of the slide. A well-functioning society requires a rich ecology of institutional arrangements differing among countries and changing over time. So let me talk about one important aspect. I mentioned earlier that neoliberal capitalism denigrated the role of the government. I think there are actually many roles for government, and I've described in this slide in the 4 of those roles. One of them is regulation, writing the rules of the game, the stoplights, protecting competition, the environment, consumers. The second, of course, is expenditures, public goods, infrastructure. And I mentioned before that in a modern knowledge-based economy, this becomes even more important. The need for education, technology, supporting the care economy, and supporting a learning economy, an innovation economy. One of the central assumptions, I said, in the middle of the last century, the conditions under which economies are efficient were analyzed, and one of the conditions was there could be no technical change. And of course, innovation is the heart of our economy, and markets don't handle innovation well. If you were asking what's the most important innovation we need right now, you'd say innovation to save the planet, to deal with climate change. We're finally getting more innovation, but we had a lot of innovation to save unskilled labor when we already have a superabundance of unskilled labor. We have unemployment of unskilled labor. So why would you spend societal resources saving unskilled labor when we're in surplus rather than saving the planet, which is in danger? Well, markets don't allocate R&D on their own well. And when we think about it, we realize how much of what we value in terms of innovation actually has come from government. We're here today partly because government-supported research led to COVID-19 vaccines. If that hadn't done that, most of the research, almost all the research for COVID-19 was financed by government and done in universities. The last mile was done in the private sector, but 90% of the last mile was still paid for by government. But the internet, which we all depend on, was actually created by the government. The browser was created by the government. These were big investments that required collective action. I could go through the list, but basically, and there was good reason for understanding why basic research has to be done by the government. It benefits all of society, goes across all the sectors. And so if you rely on the private sector, there'll be too little investment in basic research. And so if you're going to create a dynamic learning economy and society, you have to go beyond the market. To put it another way, when those who refer to Adam Smith and his invisible hand, Adam Smith lived in a very static world. What was the example that he gave of a market economy? It was a pin factory. Pin factories are very different from chips. And to think that you should look back in Adam Smith for understanding a 21st century economy is obviously going to be misguided. Another role for government is ensuring social justice through distribution, not only of income, but opportunity, health. And that here you need a progressive tax system to support the expenditures and also to achieve social justice. And that includes taxation of capital gains, dividends, and corporate profits. One of the things that is a characteristic of most economies, I think including Japan, is that the tax system is regressive, partly because capital gains are not taxed at the same rate that wages are, and that corporate profits are taxed at too low rates. An interesting aspect of President Biden's speech, a State of the Union speech a couple of days last week, was that he proposed increasing taxation of corporate profits, moving toward a more progressive tax system. So the a fundamental difference in our thinking in economics today from what it was 100 years ago or even 50 years ago is 50 years ago we thought of equilibrium, systems that were in kind of a balance, supply and demand. But today we think of a society and an economy that's constantly changing, going structural transformation. We went from agriculture to manufacturing, from manufacturing to a service and knowledge-based economy. And each of these transitions, which occupy us, our thinking, is a total movement of the fundamental relations in society. These are big transitions, and markets don't handle these structural transformations, these structural changes well. And part of my research was to understand why that's the case, and we don't have time to talk about it, but the fact of the matter is, this is a very different world than the equilibrium world that economists focused on 150 years ago. And unfortunately, too much of economic policy has been based on that equilibrium theory rather than the theory of continual structural transformation of our economy and our society. And part of the problem that of inequality and part of the problem of the tension that we have in our society, American society, is that we've not handled this structural transformation very well. There are the people in parts of our country, in the Midwest, the South, who in many ways felt left behind. And these are locations where there's low upward mobility, low levels of equality of opportunity, high levels of inequality, high levels of poverty, low levels of education, and they're trapped. And some of these places were the center of innovation 125 years ago. Ohio and Indiana and Michigan were places where the car, the airplane, bicycle originated. But then the world changed, and it moved to Silicon Valley and California, and they were left behind, and we didn't think about these individuals who were left to cope on their own, and the places that they were left to cope on their own. So we have to use all the tools to support the structural transformation towards the 21st century green economy. Now, all of this requires, of course, if there's going to be a large role for government, government has to function well, and that's why you can't separate economics from politics. Collective action is important. Collective action requires government. Government means we have to have good governance. So politics, today we recognize that economics and politics are inseparable. And so I've just had a few words here about these nature of these democratic processes with transparency, limiting the role of money in politics, something you know about here, and checks and balances not only within government but within society. And fundamental to this is to be preventing the agglomeration of power. So that leads me to the last few points that I have to wrap up, I'm told, which is this new progressive capitalism is an alternative vision where the economy is supposed to serve society, not the other way around. A good society entails more than an increase in material well-being. Progressive capitalism strives to create a better society that promotes overall well-being, including honest, trustworthy, caring individuals. A vocabulary that is used a lot, an important aspect here in Japan, is human security, living within our planetary boundaries. I think these changes are necessary for functioning of the economy in the long term, and especially important as we move towards a caring economy, an area where I said before the deficiencies in neoliberalism were particularly large. And finally, an important aspect of this new progressive capitalism is a dynamic economy and society focusing on innovation and investment based on government-funded basic research and technology, infrastructure, education, health programs, all of which is a key part of human flourishing. So a key ingredient in this new vision is rather than trickle-down economics, ignoring externalities and relying on a flawed model of corporations and allowing the agglomeration of market power, moving towards sustainable, equitable increases in standard of living, and, as I said, ensuring that we stay within our planetary boundaries. Of course, the challenge is implementing this new vision. I've discussed these issues at a very high level, and translating these into concrete policies is the real challenge of, I think, governments around the world. But I want to say one thing about that. I'm skeptical that piecemeal approaches will work. I think they may not suffice. And we see that in many governments around the world. A little more education, a little more public investment, a little more regulation here, a little less there, a little change in rules. What I describe as small tweaks to the system. I don't think that's going to be enough. What is needed is a more concerted and comprehensive change in our economic, political, and social system. It may be difficult to accomplish. One should expect strong opposition from special interests, which may be particularly influential in the political systems that allow money to matter. But for countries like the United States, I think there may be no alternative other than a more aggressive, more rapid change. And the reason I say that is it's evident for anybody looking at the news in America. You see the degree of polarization in our society, our inability in our politics to address any of the key issues, domestically or globally. Issues like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the future of democracy in the world is at stake. The international rule of law, the inability of our Congress to deal with any of the major issues which we face as a country. So the U.S., with its polarization, has led to a country with political dysfunctionality. I said in the beginning, the reason I wanted to talk about the U.S. a lot was because I think we have an expression, a canary in the coal mine. It's what happens, and it should be a sign of what happens in a society where the extremes of neoliberal capitalism have played out. And so I hope that what has happened in the U.S. is a warning of what could happen elsewhere. And I hope my analysis of what were the sources of the problem have been helpful in understanding of why it is that we've had this unhappy outcomes. And I hope that my discussion of what can be done is giving some optimism that there is an alternative that can create a more sustainable, equitable vision of our society and our economy. Thank you very much.
Professor Stiglitz, thank you very much for your presentations. From this point onward, we will go to the question session, Q&A. From the audience, we have collected the questions beforehand, and I would like to select one question out of those questions, and I will ask on their behalf. This year, U.S. presidential election is going to happen. It seems like a one-on-one battle. Already, campaign is heating up. How do you see the impact of the presidential election this time on U.S. economy and eventually to the global economy? We would like to hear your view.
Well, that was a question I sort of expected. And it is a question that everybody, that we are, nobody can be sure. But let me highlight a couple of, it is a very consequential election, both for the United States and even more for the world. And my own feeling is I wish everybody in the world could vote, because the outcome might be very different if everybody else in the world could vote. Even though you are affected, you can't vote. Part of the, there are many things that won't change. For instance, I think the U.S. will continue to have, under Trump or Biden, a strong movement away from globalization. An anti-China policy will be a central part of the foreign policy and economic policy. Both will continue with industrial policies. After a long time in which the U.S. said industrial policy was a bad thing, and Japan, of course, led the world in industrial policies. The U.S. now has embraced industrial policies, and actually, there will probably be more on the if Biden gets elected, but it will continue. But there are some very big differences. Trump's view of the world is very much zero sum. If somebody else is better, it means I'm worse off. Whereas Biden, I think, believes in the value of cooperation, and if we work together, we can all be better off. President Biden believes that climate change is a reality. Many people in the Republican Party are climate deniers, and others are climate minimizers. Say, oh yes, there's climate change, but let's not do anything about it as long as if it costs anything. Biden, I think, believes very strongly in global cooperation and working together. Probably the most important thing for me of the difference is the strong belief in democracy and all that entails. Trump tried to interfere with the peaceful transfer of power. And doesn't believe in democracy. And this is going to sound very harsh, but the Republican Party, in supporting Trump, has basically said, we don't believe in democracy too. And so they have really gone behind him, and supported him. A majority of them believe that the election was not honestly won by Biden in 2020, and that will mean that we will have problems in 2024, whatever the outcome. They have attacked the press, something, whereas Biden believes very strongly that press is really important as part of our democracy, even when it criticizes him. that is, what we call the fourth estate. Is it important? So, the Republican Party has been actively engaged in trying to suppress voting rights, to make it more difficult for people to register to vote, more difficult for people to vote. So it has clearly been on a path which is undermining democracy. And it's very hard for the United States to lead the democratic world if itself is not an example of good democracy. So to me, this will be the most important, that we will lose, the United States will lose the ability to lead, and that means the rest of the world will have to figure out how to work without that kind of leadership. The most obvious example of this is NATO. Europe has depended very heavily on U.S. armed forces for defense against Russia. And we've heard what Trump has said, that he doesn't think that they've contributed enough, let Russia take them. And when we were thinking about Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Russia could walk in at any time. So that means that Europe is going to have to create its own defense force. U.S. has already said that it's not a reliable ally because somebody like Trump could get elected. Even if he doesn't get elected, it's changing the global landscape. I could go on, but I think, are there other questions? Or?
はい、ありがとうございます。Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
お時間過ぎておりますが、会場から
We have passed the given time, but I think we can take one question from the audience. Is there a question from the audience?
では島田先生どうぞ。
Professor Shimada, please.
Professor Stiglitz, your lecture was very enlightening and systematic and educational. Thank you very much. You talked about the limits of the neoliberal economics, and I talked about the problems that neoliberal economics can lead the world. And you proposed the alternative, which is a progressive capitalism or a new vision of capitalism. My question is to increase the role of the government, even if it's a kind of a meaningful areas. It must depend upon the votes of people under the democratic society. And you talked about prerequisites for good working democracy, something like transparency of information. The role of the money is limited, and that's all well taken. But the question is how to make it possible that people choose the right kind of thing. This is a question that the United States has faced, and Japan is also faced. I'd like to get your wisdom on that.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very good question, and the hardest question. It's easy for us to say what should be done and how to get it done. So part of, if you believe in democracy, you have to believe that you have to have a well-informed citizenry. So one of the reasons I do the writing I do is partly because I believe very strongly in some of these ideas, and you hope that by explaining them and disseminating them, these ideas get understood more widely. I think, and I'm not saying this just to flatter you, I think the media is really important in disseminating ideas. The education system is obviously very important in disseminating these ideas. The difficulty is sometimes the ideas I talked about are a little bit more complicated than just the simple idea, let the free markets are going to deliver everything freely. It sounds so simple. and so the ideas I've talked about, externalities and climate change, are a little more complicated to explain, but they're not that complicated. And for younger people, you don't have to explain climate change. They feel it, they know it, they see it, and they know it's going to be part of their lives. And once you use the concept of climate change, you understand the concept of externalities, that the polluter is changing the environment, and that's affecting all of us. So intuitively, every young person, every person, should know about externalities and the need for collective action. We can debate about the best way of doing it, but there's a need for doing something about that. Seems pretty clear. The pandemic was another example. And Japan, as a very congested society, has in some sense come to understand these issues. I mean, the difference between Japan and the US is very stark. People in Japan wore masks even before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, people wore masks because they understood that it was both a way of stopping the spreading of the disease and keeping themselves healthy. In large parts of the United States, they view the mask as an interference with their freedom. But their freedom, that little inconvenience of wearing a mask, resulted in a faster spreading of the disease. So your freedom not to wear the mask was somebody else's losing their freedom to live. They might get the disease and have to go to the hospital. So in a congested society, you understand this. So it seems to me at one level, the ideas I've talked about are very understandable to everybody because we live them every day. Now, issues of transparency are also very clear. We know what goes behind closed doors and secret. People. The most interesting example of this is in Scandinavia and Sweden. People even you can find out the taxes paid by your neighbor. Even your tax returns can be looked at. You have to say who it is that is looking, but you can get access to everybody's tax returns. And everybody agrees that that's a transparent system to make sure that everybody's paying their fair share. So, I think we can understand how democratic systems fail when we don't have transparency and when we have too much agglomeration of power, which is one of the things I put on that slide. So I think we understand a lot of the basic principles, and the question is, hopefully, to keep up these kinds of discussions more and more, and eventually, that's an area where there's no alternative. The alternative to democratic debate is authoritarianism, and we know what that leads to. So democracy may be imperfect, but as I say, there is no alternative, and our job has to be to try to make sure that people do understand as widely as possible these ideas.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. We've passed the allotted time, so reluctantly I have to close this lecture session. Professor Stiglitz, thank you very much for your appearance today. Thank you indeed.